Clara, the tea is getting cold! The voice was sharp and unrelenting, cutting through the quiet of the dining room with the precision of a blade. Clara's breath punched out, fingers flexing around the tray, eyes flickering to the clock. 8:32 p.m., the chicken still in the oven, the dessert plates untouched, the kitchen a battlefield of dirty dishes and splattered sauce. Her mother-in-law's eyes were dark and unblinking, lips pursed tight. "Honestly," Eleanor bit out, voice dripping disdain, "if you're going to marry into this family, you might at least try to act like you belong here." The words landed like a slap, sharp and brutal, tearing the breath from Clara's lungs, leaving everything raw and unrelenting. Her chest ached, breath shuddering unevenly as Mark glanced away, fingers flexing weakly around his glass, eyes fixed firmly on the tablecloth. Her sister-in-law, Lisa, snorted faintly, lips curling with a smirk. "Maybe she's just not used to having guests," she drawled, voice lilting. "Or maybe she's just not used to actually doing anything." The laughter that followed was sharp and grating, each peal a splinter beneath Clara's skin. And as the tea sloshed faintly in the cups and the oven timer shrieked, and Eleanor's eyes narrowed, dark and cold, something inside her snapped. "Then pour it yourself," Clara bit out, voice flat and venomous. And as the silence fell heavy and brutal and unrelenting, and every pair of eyes swung to her with shock wide and raw, Clara's breath shuddered out, uneven and aching, fingers trembling faintly around the tray. Because maybe the worst part wasn't the way Eleanor's face blanched, or the way Lisa's mouth fell open, or the way Mark's eyes widened with a horror that twisted something sharp and bitter in her chest. Maybe the worst part was that it had taken her this long to finally snap. The silence stretched, raw and suffocating, punctuated only by the faint tick of the dining room clock and the distant hiss of the oven. Clara's breath was shallow and uneven, fingers trembling violently around the tray, eyes dark and unblinking as Eleanor's face blanched stark and unforgiving, lips parting with a faint gasp. Lisa's fork clattered against her plate, metal sharp and grating, eyes wide and gleaming with a mix of shock and something dangerously close to delight. Mark's breath punched out, eyes darting between his mother and his wife, mouth opening and closing soundlessly, fingers flexing tight around his glass. "Excuse me?" Eleanor bit out finally, voice low and venomous, eyes narrowing, dark and cold. "What did you just say to me?" Clara's breath hitched, chest aching with every shallow inhale, fingers flexing tighter around the tray, knuckles turning white, tea sloshing faintly in the cups. The words had been sharp and bitter and final, tearing free before she had had time to think, before she had had time to swallow them back down. But the ache in her chest was raw and unrelenting. Weeks and months and years of clipped orders and disdainful glances, and Mark's eyes fixed firmly on the ground, never daring to defend her. The dishes in the sink, the laundry folded neat and precise, the dinners that stretched long and quiet and suffocating, Eleanor's voice sharp and unrelenting with every demand that blurred and doubled until Clara couldn't tell where the kitchen ended, and she began. "I said," Clara bit out, voice flat but trembling, eyes dark and glassy, "if you want tea, you can pour it yourself." Eleanor's breath punched out, eyes narrowing further, lips curling faintly. "Is that so?" she drawled, voice lilting and venomous. "Well, isn't that just precious?" The words landed like a slap, sharp and mocking, Lisa's snort echoing faint and grating, Mark's hand twitching faintly around his glass. His eyes darted to Clara's, wide and pleading and dark, lips parting with a faint breath. "Clara!" he choked finally, voice cracking. Maybe you should just what?" Clara snapped, voice rising, chest aching with every word. "Apologize. Pretend everything's fine. That your mother doesn't treat me like the help every time she walks through the door?" Mark's breath hitched, face draining of color, eyes darting to Eleanor's, wide and frantic, words fracturing on his tongue. "That's not fair," he stammered, voice cracking. She doesn't mean it like that, Clara. She does," Clara bit out, voice raw and unrelenting, eyes dark and burning. "And you know she does." The confession left the air thick and suffocating, Eleanor's breath sharp and unsteady, Lisa's eyes gleaming faint and dark with a smirk that curled at the edges. The oven timer shrieked sharp and brutal, metal clicking faint as the heat billowed out, chicken steaming and golden in the tray, but no one moved to get it. "Well," Eleanor bit out finally, voice clipped, fingers flexing tight around her napkin, If you're not interested in being part of this family, Clara, I'm sure Mark could find someone who is. The words landed like a blow, sharp and final, tearing the breath from Clara's lungs, leaving everything raw and splintered and unrelenting. Her chest ached, fingers trembling so violently it was a miracle the tray didn't slip, eyes dark and wide with the hot sting of betrayal. Mark's breath punched out, eyes wide and frantic, hands half raised. "Mom! God! Mom! Don't! Clara, she doesn't mean... She's just..." But the words cracked and splintered, leaving everything sharp and cold and aching. Clara's breath shuddered out, eyes dark and glassy, fingers flexing tighter around the tray. "You know what?" she bit out, voice rising, chest aching. "I think I've had enough." The words left Eleanor's face blanching, eyes wide and unblinking, lips parting with a faint breath, Lisa's smirk slipping at the edges. "Enough of what?" Eleanor snapped, voice sharp and rising. "Enough of being ungrateful? Enough of all the things this family's done for you?" Clara's laugh was sharp and bitter and raw, eyes dark and unblinking. "Things you've done for me?" she choked, voice cracking. "I cook, I clean, I serve every meal, I fold the laundry, I make sure the house is spotless every time you decide to drop by without a call. And all that I get in return is a lecture on how I'm not good enough for your son?" Eleanor's breath hitched, eyes narrowing, dark and venomous. "Maybe if you actually put in some effort..." "Effort!" Clara snapped, voice rising. "I'm done putting in effort. If you want tea, pour it yourself. If you want dinner, cook it yourself. I'm done." The tray clattered against the dining table, cups rattling, tea sloshing faintly, Eleanor's eyes wide and furious, Mark's breath shuddering out with a faint gasp. And as Clara turned on her heel, breath shallow and uneven, fingers flexing tight around the doorframe, eyes dark and unrelenting, the silence that followed was raw and brutal and unrelenting. Mark's voice cracked faintly, raw and desperate and breaking. "Clara! God, Clara, wait! But the door swung shut with a soft click, cutting off his voice, cutting off Eleanor's eyes and Lisa's smirk, and the tea that sloshed faintly in the cups. And as the latch slid into place, Clara's breath broke, raw and ragged and uneven, tears slipping silent and unrelenting down her cheeks. Because maybe the worst part wasn't the way Eleanor's eyes had narrowed, or the way Lisa's mouth had curled, or the way Mark's eyes had widened with a horror that twisted something sharp and bitter in her chest. Maybe the worst part was that it had taken her this long to finally snap. The air outside was cold and biting, wind slashing through the darkness, headlights cutting through puddles, streetlights blurred and wavering. Clara's breath punched out, raw and uneven, fingers trembling violently around her car keys, eyes dark and unblinking. Her chest ached, raw and splintered, each breath scraping painfully, each step echoing hollow and sharp against the pavement. The words were still ringing in her ears. Eleanor's disdain and Lisa's smirk. Mark's eyes wide and pleading and so useless. Maybe if you actually put in some effort. If you're not interested in being part of this family, I'm sure Mark could find someone who is. Her fingers flexed weakly around the car door, breath shuddering out, eyes dark and glassy. Because maybe the worst part wasn't the words themselves. Maybe the worst part was that she'd believed them. Every single one. The engine roared to life, headlights cutting through the dark, tires skidding faintly on the wet pavement. Clara's breath was shallow and uneven, fingers flexing violently around the wheel, eyes dark and burning as she turned out of the driveway, leaving the warm glow of the house, leaving the curtained windows and the tea that sloshed faintly in the cups and the ring that glittered cold and unrelenting on her finger. Her phone buzzed faintly on the passenger seat, Mark's name stark and unrelenting, missed calls piling up, voicemails that blurred and doubled. Her breath hitched, fingers flexing tighter, eyes flickering dark and unblinking. Because the worst part wasn't the lies, wasn't the betrayal, wasn't even the words. It was the way she still wanted to turn back, to forgive, to pretend that maybe, somehow, it could all go back to the way it was. She pulled into her mother's driveway, gravel crunching sharp and grating, headlights washing pale against the garage door. The porch light flicked on, soft and warm, her mother's silhouette dark and wavering through the glass. The door swung open with a faint creak. Warm light spilling out, her mother's eyes wide and unblinking, lips parting with a faint gasp. "Clara?" she choked, voice cracking, fingers flexing tight around the doorframe. "Honey, what's wrong?" Clara's breath shuddered out, raw and uneven, fingers trembling so violently it was a miracle she managed to cut the engine, eyes dark and glassy. "Everything," she rasped finally, voice cracking. God, Mom, everything. You did the right thing, her mother murmured later, fingers flexing weakly around a cup of tea, eyes dark and unrelenting. Men like Mark, they never change. They just find new ways to make you doubt yourself. Clara's breath shuddered out, eyes dark and unblinking, fingers flexing weakly around the blanket. But what if I was wrong? She choked, voice cracking. What if I just overreacted? Her mother's laugh was sharp and bitter, eyes dark and burning. Honey, the only thing you did wrong was wait this long to leave. The knock came 3 days later, sharp and sudden, her mother's voice rising faintly in the hall, Mark's voice raw and cracking with every word. I just need to see her, please, Mrs. Parker. Please just let me talk to her. The door creaked open, Mark's face pale and drawn, eyes rimmed red, fingers flexing weakly around the bouquet of flowers that drooped faintly at the edges. His breath punched out, eyes wide and desperate as Clara stepped into the hall, arms crossed tight, eyes dark and unrelenting. Clara, he choked, voice cracking. Good God, thank God, I need to talk to you, please. About what? Clara bit out flatly, voice low and venomous. About how I should apologize? About how I should just keep my mouth shut and smile and pour the tea? His face crumpled, breath shuddering, eyes squeezing shut. No, God, no, Clara. Jesus, I messed up, okay? I know I did. I should have said something. I should have defended you. God, please, just come home. Her breath hitched, fingers flexing tighter, because the worst part wasn't the words. It was the way they didn't change anything. Mom was right, Mark bit out suddenly, voice cracking. You always do this. Make everything about you, make everyone the bad guy except yourself. The words landed like a blow, sharp and brutal and raw. Clara's breath punched out, eyes dark and unblinking, fingers flexing weakly. Excuse me, she bit out, voice rising. I gave up everything for you, my job, my friends, my life. I've bent over backwards trying to make your family like me, and I'm the problem? That's not what I meant. God, Clara, I didn't... Yes, it is, she snapped, voice raw and unrelenting. And maybe that's the real problem. Not your mom, not your sister, just you. The flowers drooped faintly between them, petals curling at the edges, leaves dark and withering, Mark's eyes wide and glistening and so useless. Her breath shuddered out, eyes dark and unblinking. I'm not coming back, she bit out finally, voice low and final. And as the door swung shut, cutting off his voice, cutting off the flowers that lay crumpled and broken on the porch, cutting off the words that splintered raw and desperate, Clara's breath shuddered out, fingers flexing tight, eyes dark and unblinking. Because maybe the worst part wasn't leaving. Maybe it was realizing that she should have left a long time ago. The rain came heavy that night, drops slashing against the windows, thunder rumbling low and unrelenting. Clara's breath was shallow and uneven, fingers flexing weakly around the edge of the kitchen counter, eyes dark and unblinking. The phone buzzed faintly on the counter. Mark's name stark and unrelenting, voicemails piling up, apologies that cracked and splintered with every word. Clara, please! God, just talk to me! We can fix this, I swear! Mom didn't mean it like that. She's old-fashioned, you know that. Please, I love you, don't do this. Her breath hitched, fingers flexing tight around the tea mug, eyes dark and unblinking. Because the worst part wasn't the lies. It was the way her chest still twisted painfully, the way her hands still trembled with the aching need to forgive. To pretend that maybe, somehow, it could all go back to the way it was. Eleanor's voice was a sharp clip over the phone, low and venomous, accusations that fractured and splintered with every breath. After everything this family has done for you, she bit out, voice icy and unrelenting. This is how you repay us? Running back to your mother's house like some spoiled child? Clara's laugh was sharp and bitter, eyes dark and burning, fingers flexing weakly. Everything you've done for me! She snapped, voice rising. I cooked, I cleaned, I served every meal, I folded the laundry, I did everything for you, and all I got in return was a lecture on how I'm not good enough for your son. Maybe you aren't, Eleanor sneered, voice dripping disdain. Maybe if you spent less time whining and more time being a wife, we wouldn't be in this situation. The words landed like a slap. sharp and brutal and raw, tearing the breath from Clara's lungs, leaving everything raw and splintered. Her chest ached, eyes dark and unblinking, fingers trembling so violently it was a miracle the phone didn't slip. Her mother's voice was low and unrelenting, eyes dark and burning, fingers flexing faintly around the laundry basket. "You need to block that woman's number," she bit out flatly, "before I drive down there and do it for you." Clara's breath hitched, eyes dark and glassy, fingers flexing weakly around the blanket. "She's still Mark's mom," she choked, voice cracking. "I can't just... God, Mom, what if I made a mistake?" Her mother's laugh was sharp and bitter, eyes narrowed, dark and unrelenting. "Honey, the mistake was marrying into that circus in the first place." The words landed heavy, raw and brutal and final, leaving everything splintered and bleeding. Her breath shuddered out, eyes dark and unblinking, fingers flexing weakly around the edge of the blanket. Mark showed up 2 days later, eyes rimmed red, hands trembling around the steering wheel, flowers drooping in the passenger seat. His breath punched out, eyes wide and desperate as he stepped onto the porch. Rain slashing cold and unrelenting, hair plastered dark and dripping. "Clara!" he choked, voice cracking. "Please! God, I'm sorry. I was stupid. I didn't mean any of it. I just need you to come home, please. We can fix this." Clara's breath hitched, eyes dark and unblinking, because the worst part wasn't the words. It was the way they didn't change anything. "So, what's your plan, Mark?" she bit out, voice flat and venomous. "Drag me back to that house so I can smile and serve tea while your mother criticizes me? So I can pretend that everything's fine while you stand there and say nothing?" His face crumpled, breath shuddering, eyes squeezing shut. "It's not like that. God, Clara, you're making this into a bigger deal than it has to be." "A bigger deal?" Clara choked, voice rising. "I gave up my job, my friends, my life for you, and I'm the one making a big deal." "You never wanted this," Mark snapped suddenly, eyes dark and unblinking, words raw and splintered. "You were always too good for my family, right? Miss Independent with her career and her friends. Maybe that's why you're so miserable all the time." The words cut deep, sharp and brutal and raw, breath punching out, chest aching with every shallow inhale. Clara's fingers flexed tight around the doorframe, eyes dark and unblinking. "I'm miserable because I married a coward," she bit out, voice low and unrelenting. "Someone who doesn't know how to stand up to his mother for more than 5 minutes." Mark's breath punched out, eyes wide and hollow, flowers drooping between them. "Clara, God, no, that's not—" "Save it!" she snapped, voice raw and unrelenting. "Go tell your mother she was right about me. It's not like you ever defend me anyway." And as the door swung shut, cutting off his voice, cutting off the flowers that lay crumpled and broken on the porch, cutting off the words that splintered raw and desperate, Clara's breath shuddered out, fingers flexing tight, eyes dark and unblinking. Because maybe the worst part wasn't leaving. Maybe it was realizing that she should have left a long time ago. And as the rain slashed sharp and cold against the windows, and the house stretched warm and quiet around her, Clara let herself breathe. Just a little, just enough to let her ribs expand without breaking, just enough to let herself hope that maybe, somehow, there was a light on the other side of the storm. The rain had eased to a soft drizzle by the time Clara settled on the couch in her mother's living room, knees drawn to her chest, fingers flexing weakly around a warm cup of tea. The house was quiet and warm, the scent of lavender and old books curling faintly through the air, shadows pooling soft and unthreatening beneath the lamplight. But the ache in her chest was raw and unrelenting, each breath scraping painfully, each shallow inhale a reminder of every word that had splintered sharp and brutal in the dark. Mark's voice was still ringing in her ears, pleas cracked and splintered, accusations that blurred and doubled, Eleanor's disdain cutting through everything with the precision of a blade. Because the truth wasn't freedom, not really. It was a scalpel, carving out the rot but leaving everything else bleeding and bare, exposing the cracks that had been there all along, beneath every whispered promise, beneath every soft smile, beneath every late-night call that had never truly been hers to keep. And maybe that was the hardest part. Not the lies, not the betrayal, but the love that still lingered bitter and unrelenting. The way her chest twisted painfully at the sight of his name lighting up the screen, the way her hands still trembled with the aching need to reach out, to forgive, to pretend that maybe, somehow, it could all go back to the way it was. But love built on lies was just a house of cards, fragile and doomed to collapse the second the truth came crashing in. And maybe that was the real lesson, the one that burned sharp and brutal but left something clean and raw in its wake. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't letting go. It's accepting that you've been holding on to something that was never real to begin with. Her breath shuddered out, eyes dark and unblinking, fingers flexing weakly around the cup. Because the worst part wasn't leaving. It was realizing that she should have left a long time ago. That the red flags she'd brushed aside with soft smiles and whispered reassurances hadn't been paranoia. They'd been the truth, stark and unrelenting, waiting to be seen. The truth had a price. It always did. It shattered the fragile glass of her love, leaving shards that cut deep, that left scars that might never fully fade. But it also set her free, from the lies, from the shadows, from the weight of pretending everything was okay when nothing was. Her mother's words echoed soft and unrelenting, the memory raw and aching but steady beneath her ribs. "Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free right away," she'd said, voice low and certain. "Sometimes it leaves you bleeding first. But that's the only way you get to heal." And maybe that was the real moral, the one that settled deep and aching but left something soft in its place, something that felt dangerously close to hope. That the truth wasn't about freedom, it was about clarity, about tearing away the illusions and the half-truths and the carefully constructed lies to find something real underneath, even if it left you raw and bleeding first. Sometimes the hardest part isn't walking away. It's accepting that you've been holding onto a ghost all along, because sometimes loving someone means knowing when to walk away, not because you stopped caring, but because you finally started caring about yourself more. And as the rain tapped softly against the window, and the world outside blurred into shades of gray and green, Clara let herself hope. Just a little, just enough to believe that maybe, somehow, there was a light on the other side of the storm.